I do a lot of great decisions work with senior centers where I'm speaking to 15 to 30 people. Right? I don't usually go all the way through and talk about, having some interaction with the student audience here. And if I'm teaching a class, obviously I have an interaction. But again, I know them, so I would say this is a little more in that sense.
And it looks like mostly students.
Yeah,
Is that what you were
that is the. I wish that our series, over the years, drew more faculty and staff, but we don't have a lot of. I mean, Hispanic studies, I carpool a bunch with them. They all live in the Twin Cities, so virtually our entire, it seems like more than half of our Hispanic studies department lives in the Twin Cities, and so nighttime programs are not something they get much involved with unless it's something that we've been involved with as Hispanic studies or Latino Latin American studies. It's too bad. I almost should have had you in the spring because we actually did a broader focus on this spring, but I didn't know that. Our program only decided that in August that we were. And then did you check into the guest house first?
I have not.
Okay, yeah, we'll get you over there. Okay, 10. I'm staying there also because whenever I must be on campus the next morning, I don't. I have a program that's up here till 9 o'clock. I don't turn around and go back and come up here and I stay overnight. I came up with my carpool this morning, but I'll go home tomorrow.
So, the Q&A, how do you normally do that?
I'll get up
Okay.
and invite it to start, and then I'll leave it in your hands.
Okay.
And then, and then I'll step up when I think it's ready to.
Okay. And what time are we done?
We're usually done. If you do 45, we should be done then in 75 minutes.
30 minutes.
Yeah, about 30 minutes.
The only thing I've learned over the years of doing these is just to talk to whoever's moderating Q&A or handling the mic, that if there tends to be somebody who's got a long list of anti-immigrant stuff, that there's some control or plan to give them a chance. I've certainly heard many of the commentaries, but also had other people have a chance to speak.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever had a global awareness program disrupted, which again tells you what our audience is. These are undergraduate students here. I mean, ironically, I guess we have maybe a little bit of that back in the 80s when the very politicized issues around Central America. You get occasionally students for conservative thought types would interject, but I don't think they'll come tonight. I wish they would, but they don't. It's sort of like they'll come hear their speaker, and then other people hear their speaker. If by some chance something like that were to happen, then I'll get up and inject.
You'll introduce him and just he came in 86, not 88 as I.
Oh, right.
And you don't have to say about the Nicaragua stuff, whatever you want to say.
that? Yeah, I'm going to. I think we'll just... Welcome to tonight's program. My name is Gary Prevost. I am the director of the Global Awareness Lecture Series, and welcome to what is our first program of the fall semester. We are privileged tonight to have with us John Keller. John and I go back a long time. He began his student career here back in the 1980s, before most of the people in this audience were on this planet. And John, as we were joking at dinner, fortunately survived an experience that I sent him on. He went to pick coffee in the middle of Nicaragua's civil war, where there were lots of people shooting at each other. I knew he would be safe. I'm not sure if his parents quite thought that. But it was part of an experience for John of beginning to learn the Spanish language and to understand the lives of people very different than live here, at that time at least, in Minnesota. The people that he grew up with and maybe those who he generally was in school with here, he started to learn about a wider world. And that really lent him on a journey of working for those that need a voice, those that in this world don't have power and often face those with power that will do them ill if they get the chance, unfortunately. It's sometimes not consciously, but our system that treats those who are poor, maybe those whose first language is not English, and who run afoul of our legal system. And John has really dedicated his working life to that. He made the choice that I hope some in this audience will also make, that means getting a law degree. John got his from one of our really good law schools here in Minnesota, at Hamlin Law School in 1996. And he's used that law degree to work on behalf of immigrants. That's what his work has ultimately been. He was a staff attorney at the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota from 1998 to 2004. And since 2005, he's been the executive director of that center. Tonight he has come to talk to us about a topic that is of great importance to our country, that we hope a Congress will act and come up with some changes to a legal system as it relates to immigrants to this country that needs desperately a new system. And therefore, not surprisingly, he has titled his talk tonight, Immigration Reform 2013, Fixing a Broken System in Washington, Opportunities and Warnings. John, welcome back to St. John's and St. Ben's.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. I felt like I had died and was at my own funeral there for a minute, where people say all the nice things about you that aren't always the whole picture. But it's really lovely to be back here, see old professors, old advisors, old buildings, and the spirit of St. John's and St. Ben's in all of you. So first of all, thank you for having me back. Thank you for the start that many of you helped me on when I was a young man trying to figure out what to do with my opportunities. And my goal in going through the information with you is to talk, to try to make it interesting on the one hand and bring to St. John's and to Collegeville and St. Ben's what is happening. It can sometimes feel like a very faraway place in Washington. I was joking with a young man who came to the pre-law conversation that it's almost like a study abroad program to go and work in Washington in policy, because it is another place, another culture, another set of rules, ruled by 22-year-olds for the most part in most of the congressional offices. But my goal is to talk about this in terms of the current system. What is, when you hear people talk about immigration today, which you hear about almost daily, if not multiple times a day, what is it that's broken? Most people agree across party lines that the system is not broken, that the status quo that we have had for more than 2 decades is not serving us well. What does that mean? What's working of what we have? And then what are the proposals that are out there? What would they mean to the individuals, which is really the perspective that I work in every day, but also what do they mean to Minnesota and to the greater country? The presentation assumes that you've all read the materials that were given to you before the talk, and I'm assured that I can call on you if I have questions. I'm just kidding. The materials and the PowerPoint are designed to walk people through immigration. It's not a perfect 45 minutes in terms of there are pieces that I'll leave out, but I try to hit pieces that are most impactful to our clients, and our clients are representative of most immigrants, both in Minnesota and in the U.S., and some of the challenges that they face. So I look forward to your questions at the end. I'm going to try to stick to 45 minutes, and if somebody will make sure to give me the hook or the sign if I'm going too long, I'll get started. So, can everybody hear me okay? I feel like I'm too far from the mic. What we'll talk about is these 5 or so bullet points, really who I am and what the center does. I think it's important for you to know always where your speaker comes from and the world from which they've been influenced, kind of the bigger picture of the demographic issues facing the U.S., facing Minnesota, workforce issues as well, faith perspectives on this question. You can't talk about immigration and immigration reform without talking about the role that many different faith traditions have in the current debate and also historically, and then the other issues you can see there. So Immigrant Law Center, if you're familiar with the concept of legal aid, of course, is the provision of legal services for people who can't afford private counsel. So helping people interact with the law, representing people who can't afford their own attorney. We are that service for people who need to interact with federal immigration law. They could be a citizen who has married somebody from abroad and is trying to find out how to bring that person here, or they could be somebody who's lived here for the last 10 years without status, without documents, who now are trying to figure out if there's something in this law that could help them, or maybe they've been arrested or their loved one's been arrested and facing deportation. So a really wide gamut of types of cases that we work on. Last year, we represented over 4,600 individuals, and our clients, all from Minnesota, came from 98 different countries. We attempt to also make ourselves available when there is an emerging need affecting our communities. So some of those, if you are from Minnesota, you might remember the immigration enforcement action or raid that happened in Worthington on December 12th, 2006, southwestern part of the state. Over 200 individuals arrested when ICE agents took over the meatpacking plant.
Most of those folks were deported within a week, and many in less time than that. Another recent, couple recent areas we've been able to respond is EMA stands for Emergency Medical Assistance. In the U.S. and in Minnesota, many people who don't have a permanent residency or a higher level of legal status as immigrants are barred from any sort of public health access. And that situation became worse in the summer of 2011. And we got notice that some of our clients were being cut off of dialysis, of chemotherapy. And when we looked a little bit deeper, the total number of folks being cut off at the state level was 2,500 individuals were being cut off of emergency medical assistance. So we got involved at that time. And then the last topic that I'll cover a little bit towards the end is deferred action. How many of you have heard of deferred action for childhood arrivals, or DACA? So deferred action for childhood arrivals is a program created by President Obama in June of 2012 for people who came as children who don't have status, but to allow them to be safe from deportation for a 2-year period, to get work authorization and to be able to pursue school or employment or both. And we went to work on that opportunity when it came up. We also, in addition to the legal work that we do, we work on policy. I'm the main person at the office that works on federal policy as well as state policy. And then we also do education for all kinds of groups. So moving ahead, why is immigration relevant? Some of this information you may find surprising, but the tremendous amount of growth between 2000 and 2050, about 83% of the growth in working population and 60% of total population growth will come from immigrants in the United States. So we are going to have to deal with the problem of our system in one way or another simply because of the demographics in the United States. Second reason why this has come to prominence are obviously the results of the most recent presidential election. If you look at those numbers, we've never seen those margins of Latino and Asian Americans voting for one party ever before. 71 and 76% of Latino and Asian voters voted Democratic in the presidential elections. In several states, at least 5 states, the margin of victory was because of those new American voters. It got the attention of everyone who's involved in politics, regardless of party. And finally, about 13%, a little under 13% of the U.S. population today is made up of foreign-born folks. Continuing quickly through demographics and the workforce, the challenge for all of us who are not young anymore, who studied in the 80s or earlier, is we need people to pay into Social Security to care for us as we age. The dependency ratio measures the number of workers in the workforce who are supporting retirees. Beginning a couple years ago, the number of people who are retiring and using Social Security has begun to outpace the number of high school graduates. And that trend will be with us for at least a generation. So fewer people are in the workforce, producing less money to pay for the Social Security for the baby boomer and subsequent generations who are retiring, the dependency ratio. The recession also made it less desirable to have children. So fewer babies born, both in the native-born population as well as immigrants. So we're not having as many families or young people in our families. The only state with positive population growth was, how many of you are from North Dakota? Anyone? You have little brothers and sisters, perhaps? North Dakota is the only state that experienced positive population growth. And we know why that was, right? And continues to be. Job growth. Obviously, immigrants are younger. if I had time, I'd show a bell curve that shows as the U.S.-born population grows, more of us are older and are at the top of that bell curve. And as the immigrant population arrives, the bell curve is at the bottom of the age graph. So they mirror each other. And obviously, the immigrants who are arrive with a full degree of skills. Some arrive who've not finished school, and some arrive to take the most sophisticated jobs in high-tech, engineering, or medicine, among others. The one example I find baffling is that 75% of U.S. patents come from people who were born abroad. U.S. patents. So is this something that's new? This slide, you can't see the numbers on the bottom, but at the very left is the year 1860, and at the very right is the year 2006. This is basically census data, and it shows the number of immigrants in Minnesota every 10 years during that span. The peak is 1900, 1910, and 1920. During that time, the state of Minnesota printed our ballots in 10 different languages. What languages do you think we printed them in at that time? German, Italian, Finnish. Simply look backwards in your own families, right? Those were the languages that we were printing them in. And then you can see, obviously, 2006 is the last slide. We've not reached those historic proportions. The Minnesota census data shows from 2000 to 2010 that the state grew almost 8%. The population grew almost 8%. If you break that down, where did that growth occur in Minnesota? 74% in the Latino population, 51% growth, this is growth from 2000 to 2010, in the Asian population, and then the other categories. 85% of the state's population is Caucasian, but the growth rate for the Caucasian population in the last decade was the smallest of all of those categories, 3%, a little under 3%. Still, I think I have the slide, maybe I cut it out. The percentage of foreign-born residents in Minnesota, would you say it's higher or lower than the national average? Guess. This is in the materials. Higher. I heard higher from several people. The national average I showed you earlier is almost 13% of the U.S. population is foreign-born. In Minnesota, it's 6.9%. So roughly half of the U.S. Foreign-born population. That's not what we necessarily hear or, perceive by consuming the news. Even though it's grown, it's certainly not kept up with the nation's growth in immigrants. The ways in which immigrants in Minnesota, a lot of the presentations that we've done over the last 7 years, we've done in conjunction with the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce and others who focus on this issue from an economic perspective. And part of their presentation really focuses on immigrants, looking at immigrants in a new way in terms of the state's interests as obviously workers, which we're most familiar with, number one. But I want to make sure you understand workers on that whole continuum of spectrum, from folks at the Mayo Clinic to folks at the Swift plant in Worthington. As entrepreneurs, the rate of entrepreneurship for foreign-born is greater than that of the native-born. As consumers, people who are here, who obviously have to purchase groceries, pay rent, cars, gas, etc. And then as their connection to the world economy. The other thing that we know by studying immigrant populations and even refugee populations who start at a level of trauma usually that forces them out of their home country is that their contributions, economic contributions, and their profiles change over time. So a professor at Concordia University shared some of his work with the Hmong population, and you can see within one generation for Hmong immigrants, dramatic changes. in several categories. Those contributions change over time. So faith populations, how many of you know that the Catholic Conference of Bishops is lobbying on behalf of immigration reform and has for a significant period of time, at least the last 12 years that this has been out there? They went so far after the November elections to put together their bullet points of what immigration reform should look like. And here they are. So this is from the U.S. Conference on Catholic Bishops. It should include a path to citizenship. It should preserve families, keep families together. It should allow for low-income or for low-skilled workers or people who are entering essential skill manufacturing jobs to have a legal path to enter. It should restore due process and address the root causes that send people out of their home countries in the first place. It's not, obviously the Catholics aren't alone. The evangelicals, the National Evangelical Association, a few days after the election sent their wish list to the president, and many of the bullet points are the same. So under current immigration law, now we're sort of shifting from the first part of my talk to how is the system working and what are some of the challenges today with U.S. immigration law. It is a very complex area of law. People compare it to the tax code in terms of its levels of complexity. But if you simplify it into the three main avenues in which people immigrate to the U.S. today, they are these. Our system since 1965, has been based on the idea of family being key, keeping families together or allowing families to reunify if there's somebody who's in the U.S. who's got status. So 65% of legal immigration occurs through the family processes. And it requires that close family relationship, a spouse, a parent, a sibling. The second avenue, the smaller avenue, maybe the two-lane highway, is people fleeing persecution of some kind, people who come for freedom. These are people who are displaced in their home country. You can think of Iraqis over the last several years living outside of Iraq, Syrians fleeing outside of Syria, obviously in Minnesota, Somalis who've had to flee years or decades of conflict in Somalia, largest refugee camps in Kenya, and then people in the U.S. who fear going back home, perhaps because of something that changed since they came as a student, for example, who apply for asylum. So protection under U.S. law also allows the U.S. to give people a new start here if they would be persecuted or if they have been persecuted. And then finally, employment. People can arrive in the U.S. With an employment relationship. These tend to be almost exclusively positions that Americans cannot fill. Again, areas where Microsoft, for example, needs very specialized experts and can't find U.S. qualified workers or legal immigrants to do that. Or pitchers for the Minnesota Twins, for example. We obviously haven't found enough of those either. Really from anywhere, I guess. But specialized skills that an employer can convince the U.S. government, I can't do my job or my work can't prosper if I don't bring this person in, and then they're granted the visa for that purpose. Ways in which those systems that are the bedrock of immigration aren't working. If you look at family, the express route where everything works out right, the relationship is right, and there are no obstacles to immigrating is about a 1 to 1.5 year process. Where that process bogs down is for the slowest category of sibling petitions from some countries, such as the Philippines, where that process can take 25 or more years for your relative to immigrate through a family visa petition. So all of those are clean cases, cases where there are no additional barriers or mistakes in the intending immigrant's background. If the person who you're trying to immigrate happens to have been in the U.S. without status for a year or more, an additional 10-year penalty is added to your immigration wait, so that 1 year becomes an 11-year wait for your spouse or minor children, if that's happened, or the 25-year, a 35-year wait. When you begin talking about several years' wait to reunify your family member or your small children, you begin dealing with people's human relationships in a way that betrays U.S. immigration's promise to reunify families in a meaningful and timely way. This happens, somebody comes into our office, sits down across the desk from us and says, you know, you're the lawyer, I just got married to the love of my life, and I want to bring her here. We begin talking. This is a real-life client that I talked to, and it turns out she actually had been in the U.S. for more than a year, and in fact had a child here with this guy, her spouse, but because of a death in the family had to go home. I had to deliver the unfortunate news to him that because she had left the United States and had not entered with a visa, that even though the law allows him to file a petition to reunify her and to bring back her citizen son, his citizen son, or their citizen son, she would have to wait 10 years outside of the U.S. until that penalty was paid. She's still outside the U.S., the child's being raised in both countries, and the situation is not an exception. There are many people in that situation. And then finally, if that same situation, if the woman would have left the United States, let's say for a second emergency and re-entered, she would be permanently barred from ever getting status under the current system. So that's the second part, that permanent bar definition. So even though we have created a system that prioritizes family relationships, we've also taken away from that system to such a degree with such drastic penalties that many people either choose not to because the wait is ridiculously long and uncertain, or because that pathway's been closed off. Employment is another very similar way. I mentioned Microsoft earlier. The majority of people who enter the United States as professionals can enter, but then the ability to stay and get a green card is subject to the lottery. So this last April, there were 62,000 high-skilled visas available. And there were 3 days that people could apply for those visas. Employers could apply for those visas. And within the 3 or 4 days that the applications went in, the number of applications so far exceeded the 62,000 that the Immigration Service, the process they've developed to try to be fair is to subject all of those applications to a lottery. Now, if you're Bill Gates, again, a real-life situation, and you want to expand Microsoft, and your business plans to expand Microsoft depend on bringing in a whole new division of software engineers within a certain period of time, would you be willing to build that business plan and investment on the U.S. immigration lottery system? The decision that Gates made was to expand Microsoft in Vancouver rather than in the Pacific Northwest. And that's the issue for high-skilled. Low-skilled, we have basically 5,000 entry-level or labor-based permanent visas per year for the entire nation, despite the growth in the economy in that area. Refugees and asylees, even though in Minnesota we have a disproportionate number of refugees and asylees here, nationally the cap is usually around 80,000 people that we let in, a very, very tiny fraction of the overall immigrant population. There's people who arrive for temporary purposes, quote unquote temporary, but end up being here for decades. We have one client from Liberia, if you followed at all or are familiar with the country of Liberia, the civil war and unrest that's been going on there. One of our clients has had temporary protective status in Minnesota and in the U.S. since 1991. He waits every year, usually 12 months to 18 months, to decide, to wait to see if the U.S. government will renew his temporary status yet again. Not able to convert that status into a green card, into anything. He's just locked into that very narrow protection. And also subject to being forced to go back, should the government change its mind. And then lastly, you know, the reality that we'll talk about with the legislation is for folks who are here, the estimate that immigration has right now is about 11.2 or 11.4 million people who don't have any of these avenues ripe for them to get status, have no way to go into immigration or go into their employer and apply for status. That must be done through a change in the law in Congress. So there's no path for them to get into to do it. What we have seen in the last decade has been consensus on one issue in Washington, and that is increased enforcement. There's a number of examples. The most recognizable example is the 700-mile border fence that was passed the last time we were this close to passing comprehensive reform. Reform couldn't get agreed upon between the House and the Senate, but in the fall they could agree on increased enforcement on the border. So enforcement was prioritized. If we do more enforcement up front, then maybe later we'll get to solving some of these other deeper issues. We saw record workplace enforcement under President Bush, where you had actual agents go into a place like Worthington to the Swift meatpacking plant and 5 other plants that same day and arrest hundreds of people at the same time. And then under this president, we've seen record what we call I-9 audits, where ICE agents will go into a place like the daycare that was in the news this summer in Minneapolis, Jardín Mágico, examine those I-9 audits, the forms you fill out when you apply for a job, and if there are irregularities, force that employer to terminate those workers. Under Obama, we've seen record numbers of audits that displace those workers. And then finally, all of this has a price tag and has to be authorized and voted on, so we've seen record spending on all enforcement. And you can see that last bullet point of $18 billion, which is more than the combined budgets of all of those other federal law enforcement agencies. So we get enforcement. We have done enforcement, and enforcement is being done as never before by both presidents, right? What we've seen in the last 10 years is a 250% increase in deportations, and President Obama, in his first term, deported more people than Bush did in his 2 terms, 1.5 million people. Last year, almost 410,000. So that's a bleak picture. Sorry for bumming you out, but it is part of, I'd say, the walk towards understanding what we're doing today in terms of decisions that have been made, and then what do we do when we're presented with a menu of choices moving forward. The menu of choices moving forward is where we'll go next. Obviously, the status quo is one of those choices. We can continue to spend on enforcement, even though everyone from both parties realizes that we will not deport our way out of this problem. In fact, it would be devastating to the economy to do so. Or we can look at trying to create a way, like we've done in the past, for people to earn their status or to come forward and register with new programs. And that's where we'll spend the next part of my talk. Generally, they include, again, this is a simplified explanation of a bill in the Senate that's over 1,000 pages long. But there's a component of earned legalization for those 11 million people. What are we going to do with them? Let's put them through their paces and figure out a way in which, at the end of the day, we have the people who are contributing, who've paid their fines, who are part of our communities, who've passed background checks, who are on a path to learning English and want to acquire status, who want to take that affirmative step. Some level of earned legalization. You know, what's included, how onerous will it be, how much will it cost, are details that are also in the bill. There's a second piece, the DREAM Act. How many of you have heard of the DREAM Act? Yeah. So the DREAM Act, as you know, for those of you who have heard of it, is a simple piece of legislation that says if you arrived as a child in the United States under the age of 16, and if you've graduated from high school in the United States, if you've basically become Americanized because you grew up here, we'll find a way to get you priority legal status through something like the DREAM Act. For workers who work primarily in agriculture, who are immigrants, obviously, there's a special program for agricultural workers. Why? Because ag needs immigrants in Minnesota as well as across the U.S. More than 50% of all milk produced in Minnesota and nationally is produced by Latinos who do the work that I used to do on the dairy farm I left to come to St. John's. So there's a special recognition of the value and the need and the dependency of immigrants in agriculture. Let's find a way to link that essential skill to permanent status in the U.S. There's always in these packages a concentration on enforcement. How do we prevent this situation from happening again? So one of them is something called E-Verify, electronic verification of all employees or people who apply for jobs, running people's names and data through a several federal databases, creating tamper-resistant or fraud-proof documents to prove that you're here to work legally. That's part of that employment enforcement level. Some level of creating a path for those the economy needs to enter, both for Bill Gates' work as well as for dairy farmers. If the economy is doing well and growing, immigrants play a very important role in both ends and all parts of that spectrum. But currently, as I mentioned, 5,000 permanent visas per year for those entry-level positions. It's as though there were none. So creating a meaningful way for people to enter with legal status to do the work that they're now doing without legal status. And then finally dealing with the border in some sort of smarter, more targeted manner, as well as visas. Those are the main building blocks of what reform is about in 1,000 pages and more. But you now know, if we were to have a debate about it, you could talk about the main pieces of what reform, of what's being debated in the Senate bill and what passed with 68 votes in the Senate. So again, it's a long bill, but to pull out some of the pros and cons of what passed, the other thing that's important to understand about the immigration legislative process over time and both prospectively is that no one's going to get everything they want in this bill. It will be a bipartisan bill. It will be a compromise bill. And you can see I've pulled out some of the things that are pros and cons. So there's an earned path to legalization for the 11 million, but that process, if everything goes right and we don't change the law, will take somebody 13 years to get there. There is an increased number of visas for high-skilled and essential skill or entry-level skill with workplace enforcement, so that you can't bring them in and pay them less than an American worker. You can't bring them in and put them in the most dangerous position. So protections for those workers. They can take their visa and move from an abusive employer to a new employer if that situation happens. We have improvements for the deportation process and the asylum process in the bill. We also have, with an amendment that came in the final 10 days of the Senate bill, a dramatic increase in enforcement on the southern border. So currently, we're at an all-time record of almost 20,000 Border Patrol agents on the southern border. The amendment that became part of this bill will double that over the next 10 years, an additional 20,000 people, agents on the southern border. The Border Patrol agents are one thing, but there's also an increased dependency on technology, including drones, and a much higher percentage on the borders under the bill. There is a portion, some of the students I was talking to earlier have been to the border and talked about the impact on both local communities as well as the animals. So there are pieces written into this bill that take away the jurisdiction to raise concerns about the environment by increasing, by focusing on increasing and strengthening the wall. And finally, one that, because of our work in healthcare, I can't help but point out as one of the poor political choices that was made, was to specifically exclude all of the people who will be on that 13-year track to residency and citizenship from participating in the Affordable Care Act. They will be living in Minnesota and the other 49 states, but with no access to purchase health insurance if they don't get it through their employer, through the exchanges. Despite the fact that if you look at trends in healthcare, immigrants are the healthiest people the sooner they are to arrival in the U.S. The longer they stay in the U.S., the more they adopt our unhealthy lifestyles. So those are, in one slide, 6 pros and cons. There are many more. But you get the idea that this is a bipartisan trade-off piece of legislation that got 68 votes. Another way to look at the overall legislation is to look at both estimates from on the federal economy as well as the Minnesota economy, and you can see those there. I won't spend much time on those. The Congressional Budget Office was asked to score this bill and actually came out and concluded, even with that massive increase in investment on the southern border of agents and military technology, it'll still save $135 billion over the next 10 years on deficit. So the Senate passed their bill in June, and now we're waiting the House. What we've seen immediately, almost immediately after the November 2012 election, was a realization of the importance of new Americans in the voting population by the Republican Party. And so you saw some of these, both elected officials as well as conservative thought leaders, dramatically change the way in which they talked about immigrants and Latinos particularly. It's the most amazing change in terms of national party dialogue about an issue that you can tie to one election that I've ever witnessed. Polling both in Minnesota as well as nationwide shows that when the people who are asked, do you support an earned path to legalization, and the elements of the Senate bill, predominantly in the 60 to 70% range, support what's in that Senate bill, regardless of party. You begin to see in the House particularly people who continue to talk about deportation as the only solution to the problem. Representatives like Steve King, who attacked young people, young dreamers, and basically accused the majority of them to be drug mules with calves the size of cantaloupes. I don't know, 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago. For every valedictorian that the other side wants to lift up as the ideal Dream Act kid, there are, I forget the number he said, the vast majority are drug mules. That type of harsh rhetoric, fortunately, is becoming the exception. There was a time, the last time we had this national debate, where that was a much more common statement. You know, not that statement, but to sort of demonize this population and say that there's no way we can find a way to solve this. But it's still there. The House Judiciary Committee chair has said that they will begin taking up immigration bills in October. Now, he said this a few weeks ago, and there have been a few intervening issues in Washington, but we're going to keep him to his word, hopefully. After that, we would be in a conference committee situation. The good money always is on expecting that Congress will not be able to get anything done, right? If you were a betting person, that is the status quo, unfortunately. If they fail to act, is there anything that can be done? The choices are not good, and they are limited, but we have one very clear example that I referenced at the beginning, and that's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals decision that was made by the executive, by the president. Within the deportation powers of the executive, basically what he said is, we will not deport people who fit this young person profile. People who grew up as children, came as children, and grew up in the U.S., and they meet these criteria. Deferred action has more than 500,000 applicants at this point in a little over a year nationwide. Here in Minnesota, I think the total is close to 4,500 applicants. And what this has done in terms of a conversation about immigrants, in terms of kind of, I would say, a test run of what a legalization program would look like, is very transformative. You have seen a dramatic change in the rhetoric, the negative rhetoric towards immigrants that are young. If there's one area where you had to predict they could pass a bill with both parties, it would be the DREAM Act, a standalone DREAM Act. We might disagree about how quickly that would happen or what it would include, but that's primarily because of this test run where we've invited people to come forward, to trust the government, and to get work authorization, to get driver's licenses, to continue with their college education or high school education, depending on their age, or to join the workforce, or both. Now, the Deferred Action Program, because it's an executive branch program only, depends on the president continuing to support it. It's a 2-year program. It will expire 2 years from the date your case is approved. Our office has represented over 1,000 cases in the last year of helping people apply for this. And each one of them, when they're approved, we send a letter that says, you know, hopefully this status will be reauthorized if we don't have reform, and you'll be allowed to reapply. But we don't know that. So once again, like my Liberian who's been waiting for since '91, we're creating a temporary Band-Aid fix for a problem that needs a permanent solution. But are people applying? Absolutely. Is it changing their lives? Absolutely. What we've seen in terms of now 1 year of data on this population who've applied are some pretty amazing statistics. We've seen 60% of the persons who've been approved for deferred action who either get their first job or who change jobs. We've seen 60% of them obtain a driver's license, oftentimes being the first one in their family who can legally drive. And the other statistic, we're not quite sure if this is a good thing or not, we've seen about 40% apply for their first credit card. We think they're Americanizing. But you see permission from the government to begin to live your life in a normal way, even if it is a temporary program, and a trust that this is for real. People who have personified what it's like to be here in an undocumented status have also come forward and shared their stories. How many of you are familiar with Jose Antonio Vargas? All right, so this is the cover of Time. I think it's a week and no more than 2 weeks before Obama announced the Deferred Action Program. Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, arrived in the U.S. from the Philippines at age 9, I think, and was told by his family, I think he was raised by either his grandparents or his aunt and uncle, his mom couldn't come, that he had a green card. They had a fake green card. And he went in to get his driver's license, and the person at the DMV in California told him that this is a fake. You know, get out of here, don't come back. He was so angry because he thought that he had been discriminated against. He said he was in the Twin Cities last fall because he was sure they thought he was Mexican, was his thought, because of his name. That must be why they wouldn't give me my driver's license. And when he got home, he had that difficult conversation with his guardians, and they said, oh no, you don't have status. He vowed and made good on the promise to basically prove to America that he was good enough to stay by finishing high school, by putting himself through college and becoming a journalist both at the Washington Post and the New York Times and winning a Pulitzer Prize. And so he's come out publicly and said, I have all of these pieces of paper that show my worth, but I have no piece of paper or no path to get a piece of paper to show my legality, to show I am an American. And so he started this We Are Americans campaign. If you have a moment and you want to learn more about him, I really encourage you to look up this Time issue online, as they've done a really nice multimedia piece that profiles not just him, but all of the young people you see in that cover from all over the U.S. In Minnesota, we've worked also with a number of folks who've shared their stories publicly. You can find Irma, who came, I think, at the same age, 9 or 10, grew up in a rural part of Minnesota, thought she was legal until she applied for a library card and didn't have a Social Security number. Went on, became the high school homecoming queen, got a scholarship to go to college, was going to be a nurse, but again, because she didn't have her Social Security number, couldn't become a nurse, and instead graduated from Gustavus with a political science degree, is now working in a law firm in Minneapolis with deferred action. She wants to go to law school. And then this is basically, the big questions remaining in front of us on immigration. The biggest question is, can Washington solve any big issue, right? How will the other issues impact it? Will we be faced with a choice of trying to fix several of these pieces, or just the DREAM Act, for example, or just enforcement? Are we just going to double that Border Patrol quantity? And then, of course, not too far in the distant future are the midterm elections. And what impact will that play? What we've tried to do in Minnesota is to, over the last 7.5 years, make sure that the voices that are educated on this and also willing to stand up publicly and talk about the importance of reform in Minnesota are as broad as possible. And so people who are a part of this business advocacy coalition range from the lobbying group that represents all meat manufacturers, meat packing, the Chamber of Commerce, hotel and hospitality, as well as large corporations such as Carlson, Ecolab, and Cargill on the one hand, and then sort of your traditional labor unions, faith groups on the other hand. Many people say, sort of when I get to this point, well, if you have all of that support, why haven't we gotten this done? From these wide, divergent sectors where these groups have never agreed on a policy issue before. And the main reasons, we've already talked about challenges in Washington, but also the need to take action, the need for everybody who understands this or is growing in understanding to continue to educate yourself. If this is the beginning of your exposure to this issue, don't take my word for it. Do your own research. Find a way to maybe do a paper on it, whether historical or actual. Educate yourselves and find ways to be informed. Many people think it's too complicated, but in 45 minutes, I think I'm on time, 47 minutes, we've been able to give you more information than most staffers who are helping members of Congress understand. And then a list of resources, if you want those. And then finally, ways in which, if you're interested, you can continue to get updates or find information about this issue through our Facebook page and or our action alerts. We also have a sign-up sheet if you're interested in signing up. I'll leave that up here and you can do that. With that, I know that I've raised many questions and many curiosities, and I always find that the Q&A portion, especially on a complicated area, I want to make sure you all know that you're not expected to be experts. You're probably not going to retain much of what I put in here, and all questions are valid questions, and questions that I'm happy to try to answer. So with that, I'll turn it over to a Q&A section.
Well, I indicated to him that we would have a good period of time for some questions, and he has done that, given us about 20 minutes or so for questions. So he is going to be the one to moderate this session, so think about your questions. Don't be bashful, and don't have all of the questions, please, only come from the faculty members who are present. Please, anyone with questions about this, John will gladly recognize you.
Thanks. Anybody? Yes?
I know you briefly mentioned it when you were talking about the Catholic position on immigration, but one thing I always wondered is, rather than dealing with immigration through building, absurd 700-mile fences or having to deal with the complications of visas, if a better, maybe more worthwhile approach might be to deal with the factors that cause people to come here, especially in Mexico.
Yep. Yeah. Everybody hear the question? Do we need to repeat it for the? Yeah. So so the question is, the solutions are complicated, and visa reform and immigration reform is part of it. But what about the conditions that produce the need to immigrate in the first place, and how is that addressed, or could it be addressed? And it's an excellent question. Absolutely, there is recognition in what I put up as the Catholic Council of Bishops' perspective on the need to simultaneously address poverty, basically, and unsafe living conditions in the sending countries. I don't think this is an either-or choice. What is part of the Senate bill is also not enough in my mind, but an attempt to begin to address some of those sending issue countries' problems. What we've seen already, and some of you may be familiar with this, is that immigration to the U.S. is obviously connected to both the U.S. economy's performance as well as economic performance in the sending countries. So recently, I think it was last year, we reached, for the very first time since Richard Nixon was president, a net zero migration on the southern border by a combination of both increased enforcement, but predominantly because conditions were simultaneously improving in Mexico and worsening in the U.S., that the need to immigrate decreased. So you're definitely touching on the right thing. If you only focus on that, what you miss is really what I would claim is our responsibility to the millions of people who have been here and contributing in an unregulated situation most of the time. One of the pieces of information about the 11 million folks who are here is that over 60% of them have been in the United States 10 years or more. So they've been here, and they've obviously been working. Over 40% have actually been paying state and federal taxes, is the best estimate we can find. There's an actual number that you can get if you're undocumented that the IRS has created. It's an ITIN number, individual taxpayer identification number, that allows you, if you're undocumented, to pay your taxes. So wrap your mind around that for a second. At both the state and federal levels. So we'll take your tax contribution, but we always recommend, of course, that our clients do that, or they fix taxes if they haven't paid them, as a way, obviously, to do what's right and required by the law, but also to prove that you are willing to do what you need to do to get legal status. There is not a single client, if it were required, that wouldn't pay every cent if they could, if that's what it meant to get legal status. Yeah, question over here.
Yeah, I have a question. You said about roughly 11 million to 11.4 undocumented. How many of that percentage you guys were Latinos? Are there other countries? Because I think the perceived notion is that they're all Latinos.
Oh. Yeah, great question. Yeah, the question is, of the estimate of 11.4 million people who are undocumented, are they all Latinos? There's a perception that they're all Latinos. I don't have the exact breakdown. The majority are Latinos. The majority are from Mexico. Second grouping are from Central America. But you begin to see, again, very distinct regional differences. We were talking a little bit about this over dinner, where on the coasts you see very large Chinese undocumented populations. You begin to see the importance of reform with the Asian American community, the Filipino community, which I've already talked about. It would be the second demographic group to kind of mix them together. But I don't remember the exact percentages. For some reason, it's, I want to say 65 to 70 is Latino, but I'm sure somebody could look it up on their phone before we're done. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, our work alone with the roughly 1,000 DACA students who came through our office since last June, and we continue to see about 40 people a month come through that program still. The majority are Latino, the majority are Mexican, but we have people from all over the U.S., from all over the world living in Minnesota who are also benefiting from that program. Yeah. Maybe way in the back? Yeah. Yeah, question is if I could comment on the growth of the private prison industry and its relationship to immigration enforcement. So the reality is we have created a bed quota, meaning that the target number of of beds housing immigration detainees has hovered between 30 and 35,000 people on an average on any given night. What that does is it outstrips the capacity of local jails to hold that population. And even before we started talking about the private prison industry for immigration, the private prison industry was already on the scene to deal with smaller municipal budgets primarily. So you have major interest groups who make a lot of their money from immigration detention paid for by the federal government, also working and lobbying on this issue because their forecasts a couple years ago in terms of stock performance was based on an ever-continuing number of people being detained. The average cost per day to detain somebody, again, these are not people who are detained because of a criminal conviction, but a lack of a civil immigration status, is about the average is about $86 a day per person. And where there's been dramatic increases in enforcement, primarily on the southern border, we now have, the main way in which those folks are housed are through private detention. Some, as rudimentary as tent cities in very arid desert-like conditions. It's a whole nother level of this, but you can't talk about the status quo without talking about the machinery of enforcement and detention that exists right now. The other reality that affects us as lawyers in this process is we represent people who are facing deportation, and when we interview them and we find a person who has a case that actually has a good defense and we can win that case, we have to inform them of some hard truths. One is, if you're eligible for a bond, because not everybody's eligible for a bond, the average bond that you have to pay in cash is between $7,500 and $10,000. If you can't pay that, you're looking at probably a 2 to 3 month wait to have a final trial while you're detained. And if you are lucky enough to pay your bond and get out and pursue your defense, the average wait time to have your trial on a meritorious case in Minnesota right now is 2.5 to 3 years of a wait. So we've, you know, it's like the python who's digesting, you know, a zebra. It's a bad analogy, but we've invested all of this money to arrest people and to put them in custody. At the very same time, we've ignored providing enough resources so they can move through that process in a humane fashion. And a lot of people, you know, if you're in that situation, you've never been in detention, simply make the choice, sometimes with pretty aggressive prodding by the ICE agent, to simply give up and be deported in a short amount of time. Yeah, we'll take one more in the back and then we'll come up here. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, great question. So it's a question about kind of some of these really big issues that are occupying Washington's time and energy, the debt ceiling and government shutdown, minimum wage. I'm not sure that they're worried much about that at this point. What was the other one? Oh, the Affordable Care Act, obviously. You know, the one advantage I can say about the preoccupation with the Affordable Care Act over the August recess, when everybody was back home, was nobody was worried about immigration from the anti-immigration folks' side. I think anytime controversial issues, serious issues, I mean, don't take away from my conversation tonight the fact that I think this is a simple issue to solve. It's an extremely complex issue. We have a really tortured relationship with immigrants in this country. The expression I heard, I wish I could remember who used it, but I think it's accurate, is we tend to love yesterday's immigrants and despise today's. I think that portrays kind of a reflection that people who've come in the past are the good immigrants, even though we know when you look back at those periods, whether it be Catholics who weren't to be trusted at one point, or the Chinese, or the Southern Europeans, you know, who wouldn't work and who were all criminals, or the Irish. At the moment of immigration, there was also intense hostility. One of the nuns I used to work with in Wilmer still kept the "No Irish should apply" sign in her office. I don't know if it was an actual sign, but she made it to remind folks in Wilmer that we've been down this path before. The reality with Washington, all of you who follow it know, is that there is a certain amount of political oxygen in the very limited number of actual working days that folks are expected to be there and do something. What I can say about immigration is we are in a position that we have not been in, I would say, since before 9/11, in terms of almost getting there. We are almost there. It is clear from the work that's being done in Washington that if the Senate bill were brought up for a vote in the House as is, there would be a majority of votes to pass it. You know, that's kind of shocking to say because everything you hear about the House is that it'll never pass or that they'll only do enforcement. But the reality is what you can see in that polling and what we have in terms of formal head counts of Republicans are anywhere from 25 to 40 Republicans who have said they'll vote for something very similar to the Senate bill. So then you start to examine what are the other issues that are, you know, at play. We've already taken the Affordable Care Act out of immigration reform. So that's not really it. The fact that the Affordable Care Act, you know, once again is the top priority for the House to defund isn't about immigration. It's about the top priority for certain segments of the House, and also positioning themselves for the 2014 elections with their base. But I am confident. You know, we continue to see people make dramatic changes in how they talk about immigration here in Minnesota alone, I guess except for the local representative from this area. We have seen dramatic changes in the way in which both conservative Democrats on the western border, Colin Peterson, who now endorses the Senate bill, he voted against the DREAM Act in 2010, Colin Peterson, Democrat. And then you see people like John Klein and Eric Paulson, not necessarily a moderate Republican in John Klein, a pretty conservative Republican, saying publicly and even more so privately that they recognize we have to do something, the system's broken, and that they expect something to be done in 2013. So there's reason for optimism. The other reason I would say is that the broad array of groups who are credible on this issue, who bring a diverse set of constituencies and members from both very powerful large corporations to labor unions to faith groups, is more organized and more active and more effective, frankly, than we've ever been. So if they don't pass it, you know, it's not going to go away. Nobody would vote for the status quo. So yeah, there's a question up here. Could you repeat the question? Sorry. Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, great question. So as I understand the question, it is if you commit a crime, it can impact your ability to get a status. And how severe do those crimes have to be, or what's the range of severity of crimes that can deny you status? It's a great question. Yeah, you know, again, looking back in history, we have both excluded people from entering and deported people for what we thought were the moral norms, and sometimes that, of course, includes criminal behavior, but, you know, simply being, having an infection in the past, an infectious disease, as recent as AIDS. You know, we prevented people with AIDS from entering for quite a while. And then, of course, you know, other conduct that isn't a convicted crime can prevent you from entering. Being associated with somebody suspected or some group that's suspected of terrorism is one of those really difficult areas in terms of the intersection with immigration law. With actual criminal convictions, our office has one kind of sub-practice area where we provide legal advice and technical advice to the state's public defender system, so that when a public defender is representing somebody who is not a U.S. citizen, somebody who has a green card or somebody who has no status, that public defender understands the deportation consequences of whatever they're going to recommend their client do, go to trial or take a plea. And unfortunately, since 1996, when this area was dramatically changed to make it easier to deport people, we have seen that very minor crimes, such as 2 shopliftings of even minor value under $10, over the course of your lifetime, these are called crimes involving moral turpitude, can take away your entire history of permanent residency. You are subject to removal with 2 crimes involving moral turpitude. Another one, I actually don't speak to a lot of college students, but giving a false ID to law enforcement is a crime involving moral turpitude. You have given false information, and if you had 2 of those, you could be removed for it. I know that doesn't happen on college campuses. But, you know, there are people in real life who need a fake driver's license or a fake green card to work, who then get pulled over and see kind of this precipitous path that often starts with a local law enforcement arrest that then leads to ICE detention. So there are folks, of course, who use fake IDs. Did I answer your question? No. Yeah, so it used to be bad, but you used to basically have to have served 5 years of a criminal sentence, and you were almost automatically deported. That is not the case anymore. 2 very minor crimes can make you deportable, and even a crime with less than a year sentence where you've served none of those days behind bars can make you mandatorily detained. So, yeah. We have time for one more? Yep.
Does the Senate bill address that question? Or is that an example of even if the Senate
What-
bill passed the House or something like that?
Yeah, the Senate bill...
Still be a challenge.
One of the areas where in that one bullet point, or the one box, I said that due process is restored in some ways under the Senate bill. What was also taken away in the reforms of 1996 was the ability for an immigration judge to exercise his or her discretion when somebody's facing deportation. In many cases, we created basically a system of, you know, one strike and you're out, criminal or moral turpitude type crimes, where if you appear before a judge and you have that, basically you're done. What's restored in some meaningful degree with the Senate bill is the ability for a judge to weigh and actually act like a judge the negative and your overall equities over maybe your lifetime here, including your U.S. citizen kids. So, I think.
Well, you've been an excellent audience. I appreciate that you had some very excellent questions for John. If you didn't get a chance to have your question asked, he's not rushing back to the Twin Cities. He's actually staying with us tonight, so he can be up here and answer your questions privately. So I thank all of you for coming. There will be other global awareness lecture programs this semester. Coming up on the 23rd of October, we do our annual co-sponsorship of a program with the Witness for Peace organization, where we will have a representative from a Mexican human rights organization will be joining us. And on Wednesday, November the 20th, Professor Al Montero from Carleton College will be talking to us about Brazil's emergence as a, as he calls it, a serious country in the 21st century. So watch for the notifications on those and join us for the future programs. And again, John, thank you very much.